Good morning, tribe. I trust you're doing very well. Yes, one of the teachers coined this the mantra march. And I like this. The mantra march is you go on a march and you're chanting your mantras. Why is that important? It helps your narratives, your nerves, and your nature. So what do you do on a mantra march? You just go on a march like this and you chant the things that you want to be. So for me today, I want to encourage you that number one, you're sitting on the mountain of value. You work for it. You need to own this. So I would think of my mountain of value, all the things I've achieved that makes me great, all the things that you've achieved have made you great. And as you're marching, you just be saying, I worked for this, I own this. 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 And you keep marching, keep saying that. As you're saying that, neurological pathways are being created, your heart's feeling good, your mind's feeling good, you're taking in fresh oxygen, and you're focused for the day. Anybody that comes to affect you from the past or the future, you tell them this. I worked for this, I own this. I worked for this, I own this. You're not gonna let anybody come into your life and take away the things you've worked for. You worked for the family, you own that. You worked for your career, you own that. You worked for your health, you own that. You worked for your mind, you own that. You worked for your money, you own that. You worked for everything great in your life, now own it. Let nothing or no one take that away from you. I worked for this, I own this. 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 So if anybody comes into your life to try and criticize you, if you try to criticize you, tell that voice, I worked for this. I own this. Let's go.